stuff sorted out. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Today is going to be all about workflow triggers. Our title of our presentation today is Unlocking the Secrets of Dubsado's Workflow Triggers. If you don't know me, I am Trevor Lecca, Dubsado's Customer Education Specialist. I'll be your host today. And workflows are always an evergreen topic to talk about. No matter if you're new to Dubsado or if you've been with us for a while, everyone wants to know how to get automations going and how to just learn more and set things up even better and better. So today we're going to get into a ton of really the nitty gritty of how to set things up in Dubsado the best as far as workflows are concerned. And in my opinion, triggers are probably one of the stickiest pieces to learn because there's so many triggers and they do so many different robust things. So we're going to really get into it. And yeah, let's get going. So what's on the agenda today? So firstly, we're going to do kind of a broad overview. I know that some folks here, like I said, are going to be relatively new and some folks have probably been with Dubsado for a little while, but I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as understanding the terms that we're going to be working with today. So we're going to go over a pretty nice definition of terms, and then we're going to go over all of our workflow triggers. We're going to categorize those triggers into different kind of buckets and go from there. That will help us understand all the different things that the workflows can do. And then once we have a really good foundation of what those workflow triggers can do, as well as workflows in general, we're going to go ahead and do a deeper dive on a couple of key topics here. Those being after form not completed, after invoice installment paid, appointment-based triggers, as well as the action hold actions until. When I'm talking to folks in chat, since I'm on the customer care team, or when I'm doing screen share calls, I would say that those four things are the most common things I see folks struggling with. So I really wanted to make sure I took time to go through these things in depth and just make sure that there's a lot of clarity there in case you want to use any of these items in your own workflows. And using these items effectively will make your systems more robust and more effective with your clients and save you a lot more time. Lastly, if we have time, we're going to get to our extra credit, which is just going to go over what to expect when you're clicking that Update Project Workflows button. If you've been with Dubsado for a little bit, you might know what I'm talking about, but there are some really specific logic. There's some really good logic that goes along with that button. And I think that going over how that works is going to be helpful for everybody involved. So we're going to jump right to it. That's what we got today. All right. So jumping into our workflow overview, we're just going to start defining our terms here. So what is a workflow? We're going to start at the beginning, start right at the start here. So workflow in Dubsado is the word that we use when we're referring to our automations. So simply put, a workflow is a series of automated steps. Now, the length of your workflow can be anything. It can be a single step that's still a workflow, or it can be your entire business process all out in one workflow. Some folks have, a daisy chain of workflows, 3 or 4 things connected, and that works too. There's no limit or requirement as far as how long or how short your workflow can be. Each step of a workflow is comprised of 2 basic parts, one being an action and the next being a trigger. And so let's jump into a little bit more about what those are. All right. So what's an action? An action is the function that you'd like that workflow step to accomplish. Pretty straightforward. Now, we do have a lot of different workflow actions. And so I split these up into 3 different content categories. In total, there's 15. So let's just go through them right now. We have our sending content actions. And so that would include send email, send form, send contract, send primary invoice, create invoice, and send appointment scheduler. I know that create invoice sounds like it might not be a sending content action, but since the create invoice action actually gives you the ability to send an email with that invoice that was created, we throw that into the sending content category. Next, we have project management, which is going to include change project status, add tag, create to do, activate portal, deactivate portal, and archive project. And then lastly, we have our workflow management, which is pause workflow, hold actions until, and we're going to dive deeper on that one in particular, and start a workflow. I know that's a whole lot to wrap your head around. The good thing is that most of these actions are relatively straightforward as far as they kind of just do what they're talking about, but we're still going to go into a bit more detail here. So hang tight. All right. What is a trigger? So this is the other half of what comprises one workflow step. And we're going to be talking mostly about triggers today. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper here. The workflow trigger is the when component of the workflow step. So just that bottom piece when you first pull up a workflow action modal. And it's going to be either the exact date and time or the condition that will need to be met before an action runs. And that's going to determine your flow essentially. So workflow triggers can be split into 2 different kinds, relative versus fixed. Now, workflow triggers will default to relative and 0 days after a previous action is complete. But we'll talk a little bit about fixed right now just to kind of get it out of the way. But the idea is that most of the time we're going to be using relative triggers since they give us the widest breadth of options as far as when to time our actions. Because we're going to be looking at other conditions specific to the project that you're in. A fixed date trigger, on the other hand, allows you to pick an exact date and time to determine when that action runs. Now, we do recommend only using fixed date triggers, as sparingly as possible, especially within your workflow templates. And the key there is that you would need to manually update that date and time as soon as it had elapsed, essentially. So, for example, if I pick tomorrow as a fixed date and time, as soon as that date and time that I've set in my workflow elapses, and now it's Friday, let's say, that date's in the past and that can cause some issues. So generally speaking, when you're setting up your workflows, you're going to be using a relative trigger. And today, for the rest of our conversation, we're only going to be looking at our relative triggers. All right. Make sure I'm not missing anything here in chat. Hey, Desiree. I'm glad that last webinar was really helpful. That's awesome. Cool. And if at any time, y'all, you have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I will be double checking chat periodically and keeping an eye on over there. So I know workflows can be a complicated topic occasionally. And if you have questions as they come up that I'm talking about, I'd much rather address them as we're discussing that topic as opposed to jumping all the way to the end. Anytime you like to ask questions is totally fine by me. I'll keep my eye on that. All right. Cool. Let's go ahead and move on from our relative versus fixed. So like I said, we're only talking about relative triggers today. And as far as our relative triggers are concerned, we have 14 of them in total. I've again broken these down into kind of buckets to kind of just categorize them a little bit better, since I think thinking about them as far as their overall purpose is a little bit more helpful than just looking at that chunky list view. Oh, Jillian, good question. I actually did not already say that. So in case any of y'all were wondering, the recording will be sent out within 24 hours of our recording finishing here, as well as these slides will be included in that email, just in case you want to go back through both the recording and our slides here. You can go back through both of those things, and we'll send that out to y'all afterwards. Okay. Good question, Jolinda. Oh, Jolinda, apologies. All right. Anyways, relative triggers. So we have our 4 different categories of our 14 relative triggers. So let's just go through them slowly, since these are the ones we're going to be talking about today. So in the general category, we have after workflow started and after all previous actions complete. Now, after workflow started, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just the next slide here, is not used too often, but after all previous actions complete is definitely a big one to understand, because it's one of the more common ones that you'll see used just in general across all of our users. Our project date triggers are looking specifically at the project start or end date. Now, if you aren't aware of where to set that project date, we will talk about that in just a little bit. The client progress triggers include after form is completed, after invoice paid in full, after invoice installment paid, and we're going to dig deeper on that one. The after contract signed by clients, and after form is not completed. And again, we're going to look at that one a little bit more closely as well. And then lastly, we have our appointment-based triggers, and that's after an appointment is scheduled, before an appointment start time, and after an appointment has ended. So we've got quite a bit to work through today, so let's just keep on trucking here. So we're going to start here with our general triggers. Our after workflow started is used to time an action to run after or in relative to when the workflow is applied to the project. So keep in mind that a workflow will run as soon as it's applied to that project. And a workflow can be applied either manually by you in the projects tab in the workflows tab of the project, or via a lead capture form or public proposal. So when a workflow is applied via a lead capture form or public proposal, since it's getting applied immediately in those 2 scenarios and it's going to begin running, the after workflow started trigger is really keeping track of when that project was created, which in my opinion can be a bit more helpful and easier to think about when you're setting up your workflow. Sometimes if you're thinking, okay, when did the workflow begin? You then have to double back to like, hey, when did that project get created if it's happening automatically? So if you're someone that uses a lead capture form or a public proposal, that's helpful to think about and to remember how that project is getting created, since that workflow is getting started off right away. And this trigger is most commonly used for the action that's first in a workflow, but it can be used anywhere in a workflow. Nothing's stopping you from putting a, after workflow started anywhere else in your flow if you'd like. Pardon me. Looks like we got a couple questions here. Take a look at this. Bridget, I'm just reading your question real quick. Okay. Bridget was asking a question about having a scheduler, and I'm guessing your scheduler is probably on your website. If it's not, then we'll talk about it in either case. Really, what I wanted to say, Bridget, is that hang tight. We're going to talk about those appointment-based triggers, and your question will definitely get answered in just a little while. So hang tight on that one. Ariana, let's see what you got here. Okay, so Ariana was asking about contract reminders and invoice reminders. So contract reminders could be set up via a workflow, and it sounds like you might already have that. But invoice reminders, good thing to note here, invoice reminders should usually be set up in the payment plan template that you're going to be using, since the payment plan is the place to actually set up reminders on that per installment basis. So we're not going to talk too much about invoice reminders today, but that would be where you'd want to go ahead and do that. All right, let's keep on moving here with the presentation. Actually, before we do that, I do have a bunch of sample workflows that I've mocked up for y'all, and we'll jump into Dubsado and let's actually look at them together. So for general triggers, I've got this 3-step workflow. Let's go ahead and look at it real quick. Okay, so here's my general triggers workflow. And this is going to be including both that immediately after workflow started trigger, or the after workflow started trigger, and after all previous actions complete. So first thing we have here is after workflow started. Again, like I mentioned, most commonly we'll see that happen at the beginning of a workflow. And then we have a create to do action right here. And so this is going to be happening immediately after all previous actions completed. Now, as soon as we talk a little bit more about all previous actions, we're going to come back here and we'll see how those two things are going to interact with one another, because it sounds like if you just look at this the way it is in the template, that both of these things are going to happen at the same time, which would then activate that portal straight away, right? Since that one's also after all previous actions. But when this to-do gets created, we'll see something else happen here. So we'll come back in just a second to that. So after the workflow started, now we have after our previous actions complete, the other trigger we're using in that example workflow. Now this is used to time an action to run as soon as every other action that precedes it has been completed, and that includes to-dos, which is what I had in my example there. So when viewing a workflow within a project, an action that has been completed will be denoted with a bold black check mark. And if an action does not have that check mark next to it, it means that it hasn't been completed. And additionally, since in a template, that to-do is not going to show you that little extra check mark, but in a project, it will. And that extra checkbox rather, will also need to be checked off in order for after all previous actions completed to actually fire. So we'll actually go ahead and apply that workflow to a project, and you can see exactly what I mean in case you haven't seen this work before. So let's head on over to my projects page here. No worries. So right now I'm just in a project, right? And like I was mentioning, if you are not familiar with applying a workflow manually, you're going to go ahead and just click on the project, go to the workflows tab. Then from there, you can go ahead and apply your workflow. I'm going to archive this workflow since that's the one I did when it wasn't working. And we'll go ahead and do it again. So right now, if there's no workflows applied, all I need to do is click apply a workflow and then click general triggers and then say apply. Now, once I get back to this workflow here, we'll see here that since this first action was after workflow started, it's going to fire right away, and it just did. This next one here is a create to do that was set to after all previous actions complete. And so for its create to do, it's going to create that task, that to do right away, but it's not going to get checked off right away. That's a manual step that you'll need to do yourself. So that means that this last step here, which is also after all previous actions complete, is not going to be checked off just yet. As soon as I go ahead and check that box, then as soon as it loads, it's going to actually activate that portal as soon as it's done with that one. So I just wanted to show how those two different triggers rather, can be used in one workflow here and how they kind of operate. Yep. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, that's very true. Not even tech companies are immune. So again, apologies, everybody. All right. That was our first little workflow example. We have a bunch more workflow examples to get to, so hang tight. We're going to get to those in just a second here. Let's jump back over. And I'm going to go full screen. All right. So next up for our categories of workflow triggers are our project date triggers. So project date triggers are going to be used to set an action or time an action in relation to that project start or end date. Now, you can manually set that project date within a project at any time that you like. That date's going to be right below the title of that project. And you can click on it where it says set dates and pick a date and time that you like. Then Or rather, your clients can select that project date if you want to let them by adding a date select element onto a form. So either you can set it yourself manually in the project, or you can use that date select element on any of your forms and let the client tell you their project date if you'd like to. And that will automatically add that date to that spot there. So the key here that I really wanted to talk about is that there's kind of two different ways that you can have that project date set. If you only have a singular date, right? It's only one date, and that would be mapping it to that project date field on your form. It's going to be set as both the project start date and the project end date. And so that's relevant in the sense that there's 4 different project date triggers. It's before and after, or before project start dates, after project start date, right? So that's both looking at that date, and then before project end dates and after project end date, right? So if you only have one date, all 4 of those things are essentially looking at that same date. So it's something important to keep in mind. And the corollary to that is that if you have a date range here, as you can see in this little example, that first project date, right? 219, the earlier project date, that's going to be the start date, whereas 221 is going to be that project end date. And so those triggers are going to behave a little bit differently if you do have a range. Now, that's just important to keep in mind, because if you only have that one date, like I said, you don't have to pay too much attention to which of those triggers you're using as long as you're doing before or after. But if you do have that range, you're going to need to be picking specifically the correct trigger there. Let me take a look over here in chat, make sure everything's good. Lisa, the trigger for that first action in the general triggers workflow is after workflow started. All right. Okay. Joni, good question. So like I was saying, the best way to trigger a project date and workflows based on a lead capture form being submitted is if on that lead capture form, you're going to add that date select element. And I can actually show you all what that looks like in just a second here if you want. It's going to be mapped to project date. When the client then selects their dates, it will automatically go into that field there, which is right here. It'll end up showing right there if the client selects it, so long as that field is mapped. So let's actually jump over to Dubsado real quick, and I'll show you my little workflow for this guy. Okay. Actually, before we do that, I'm going to archive this workflow. All right. So to answer Joni's question real quick, if I go to my lead capture form real quick, we can see what is your event date. See where it says select dates. Over here on the field mapping, if I have this set to project date, that's telling the system to enter just one date, right? And as a client, I would be able to pick just a singular date. Whereas if I were to click this field mapping drop down here and say project start dates, then I could add in another field here and then add a project end date if I wanted to. So I can do something like that, map this to project end dates. Doing it like this, I know it says start date right there. Go ahead and just ignore that for the time being. This one's mapped to project start date. That one's mapped to project end date. Doing it this way would give you that date range. And so depending on your industry, that could be relevant, right? If you have, hey, I know I'm going to have a multi-day event, right? Then you'd want to know when your client starts and when they want to end, right? That's how you get that range. Otherwise, what most folks usually do, and again, it's going to be very industry specific, is they just have this map to project date, and that's just picking that singular date. All right, let's go ahead and head back, and let's go ahead and take a look at my workflow for this guy. So what you'll see commonly is if you're not paying attention to where that project date is being set and what your triggers are in your workflow, you can end up with a too late to send error. And I made an example here so that it would error on purpose. So bear in mind, right, you're going back through the slides here and you're looking at the recording. This is an example of what maybe not to do, although people do 12 weeks before project start date all the time. It's just something to be cognizant of. That's all I'm trying to say. But in this example, right, 12 weeks, which is 3 months, is a decent amount of lead time, right, ahead of time. That's going to be something to keep in mind, because if your client picks a date that's less than 3 months away, they're going to end up receiving a too late to send error. Let's jump back over to the slides real quick, and then we'll come back and test that out. I apologize. I've got to click through to present every time. We're getting going. All right. So this is what I was mentioning just now, right? So if your project date ends up triggering a date in the past, you'll see that too late to send error in your workflow. And if you're not familiar with workflow errors, a workflow error will automatically pause your workflow, which isn't great. Obviously, the whole idea of workflows is to automate things, and pausing things means that you're going to have to manually go into that workflow to unpause it after you fix that error. So like I was saying, if you have 3 months for project dates and the project date is less than 3 months away, that date will be in the past and you will see this too late to send error. So as you can see here in the example, 219 is definitely within 3 months of my action happening here. So that 11/27 dates is the 3 months in the past from the project date. And we can see that since that date's in the past, it's going to get that too late to send action. And if you have any actions in your workflow that are in the past, it will pause your workflow immediately, regardless of where it falls in that workflow. I know I only have one action in this flow real quick, but let's just show you what it looks like because it'll just pop up straight away. So if I go ahead and apply this workflow, I'll give it a second to think about it. Okay, there we go. See, pretty much as soon as the system thinks about it, it notes that it's too late to send. And since if I refresh my page here, that active badge will change to paused. There we go. So that's going to pause your workflow. So if I had subsequent actions here, that's going to be an issue. So just something to really keep an eye on, especially if you're letting your clients select their own date, since clients could in theory select any date on that date select. And using a big chunk of time, like a big lead time, is something just to really be aware of. All right, let's jump back over into Dubsado here, or sorry, into the presentations rather. Cool. All right, we got that guy. All right, now we're going to move on over to our client progress triggers. And so these 5 are some pretty juicy ones. I'd say that these ones get used very frequently, and they're also pretty powerful triggers. So we're going to take some time to go through all these. All right, so after form is completed, is timing an action to run relative to a client submitting either a questionnaire, a proposal, or a sub-agreement. And in order for the workflow to watch for that form's completion, the workflow must send that form in question. So when it says it must send it in question, that the form that's in question means that if you are someone that likes to maybe manually customize your proposal and send it out yourself, the workflow won't be able to watch for that proposal's completion if it's not responsible for sending it, or it's not responsible for applying it and sending it rather. I don't see too many folks trying to do things that way. It's just something to be cognizant of if you're just trying to time something off of a particular form. Next down, we have after invoice paid in full, which is going to time the action to run relative to when the entire balance of that primary invoice in the project is paid, or when the system sees that there is a $0 remainder. Now that's going to function the same for payments that are applied manually, since you could just go in and apply manually a payments if you got paid via cash or check. And it'll work that same exact way if they pay you via, Stripe, Square, or PayPal, one of the payment processor options. Next up, we have after contract signed. And so that's going to be looking at when the client signs that contract rather. It is not looking at your counter signature field. So if you're like, hey, I have a after contract signed trigger and I want to make sure I don't accidentally trigger my workflow yet, no worries there. It's not looking at your business owner counter signature field. It's only looking at when the client signs and then submits that contract. Now, the sub-agreements, right? They have signature fields as well. The after contract signed will not function for sub-agreements. It's only going to be for main contracts in your project. If you're trying to time something after a sub-agreement was submitted, then you can use after form is completed, since a sub-agreement is qualifies as a form there. Oh, the last thing to note here about after contract signed is that it actually does not need to be sent in the workflow. And the important distinction there is that since a project can only have one main contract, the system always knows what that contract is and which one you're referring to. Since you can have any number of forms in a project, you have to send it in the workflow. So the workflow knows which form to watch. By contrast, that contract is always only one. So as long as there's a contract applied somewhere in the project, you could have sent it any which way. The workflow will be able to see if that particular contract has been signed or not. So that's nice. After invoice installment paid in full is going to time an action relative to a specific installment on the payment plan and seeing if it's been paid. And we're going to do a little deeper dive on that one, like I was mentioning. And then after form is not completed, it's going to time an action to run relative to the most recent time a form was sent. This one can be tricky, and we're definitely going to take some time to talk about it in a little bit. And I have a little bit of a test for y'all, so it's gonna be great. Keep an eye out for it. Okay. Before we get to appointment triggers, let's go ahead and look at my sample workflow for our client progress. Let's go ahead and archive this guy. How are we doing in chat? Everyone doing all right? I know we've had some hiccups here, but we're good. We're going here. Workflow setup. Patty, good question. So if the invoice is paid in full, it does not need to be sent by the workflow in order for it to trigger, right? So as long as that invoice is set to the primary invoice, it's always gonna be able to see that, kind of in a similar fashion to the workflow always being able to see the contract. Good question. That's a really good point. The invoice triggers in our workflow actions are only looking at the primary invoice. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a while as well, talking a little bit about a different point, but the concept remains that the primary invoice is how the system knows which invoice to watch for those sorts of things. All right. Madeline, sorry. Good question about recurring workflows. So currently in Dubsado, there's nothing that's set up that's going to automatically run the same workflow over and over again. The best way you can do it is kind of what I've been doing here in my sample, right? I had a workflow applied. As soon as I was done with it, I archived it, and then I could then reapply that same workflow. Before I apply this, I'm going to go ahead and show my template. But the idea is if you had a workflow that wanted to run once a week, you'd let it run. As soon as it was done, you could archive it and then reapply it, since you cannot apply the same workflow template to a project more than once at a time. Good question, though. All right, let's jump over here into my workflow templates. All right, so this one's a little bit longer, right? My client progress flow. I tried to use all of those triggers that we were just talking about as far as our client progress bucket. So right off the bat here, I'm sending a proposal as soon as all previous actions are complete. Again, that one's really common to see at the beginning of a workflow, and that one makes sense because there are no previous actions. So we're kind of tying in those general triggers with our client progress triggers. After that, right, I have send form if form is not completed in one day. And that might look a little bit funky, but this is actually the best way to set up a form reminder. So if anybody's not familiar with that, I'm going to edit this and take a look at it a little bit closer. The idea here is I'm going to do send form again, right? And I'm going to go ahead and tell it to watch for completion of that proposal. Then I'm going to tell it to send the exact same form, because it's not going to create an additional copy of that form. It's going to send the same exact link that was already sent by the workflow. And that's exactly how we would set up a reminder to go ahead and fill out a form that was already sent. Next up, we're going to change project status after the contract was signed by client. And I have my own project status set up to go ahead and set it to contract signed. Same thing for change project status here after invoice installment paid, which is sending it to the deposit paid status. Then I'm going to go ahead and activate the portal as soon as they complete the proposal, right? So this was looking at after form is completed, and we're going to go ahead and tell it to watch that proposal. And then last one, I'm going to send them a thank you email as soon as they finish paying me if they've paid in full, right? So this is just a pretty quick down and dirty flow that's using all those different triggers, but those are pretty common use cases for all those triggers, I would say. I don't think there's any errors that we're going to see pop up here since I know I have this set up correctly. But hopefully that going through each of these and kind of just showing you a good example of how to utilize those triggers is going to be enough. I don't think we need to apply that to a workflow, or sorry, apply that to a project rather. All right, Ali, let's see what your question is. What's a booking request form triggers? Workflow. Ali, I think what you're asking, right, is if you manually send that form, then it won't happen. So it depends on how you manually send it, right? As long as you are manually sending the copy that the workflow applied. And when I say the copy that the workflow applied, let's go back to my project here and take a look. So this is something I didn't touch on, but it is definitely good workflow knowledge to know. As soon as this one didn't have it. So let's actually go ahead and apply my client progress workflow since it's got some forms in it. So you'll note here, right, before I do that, if I go to the forms tab of this project, there are no forms here just yet, right? I haven't added any forms manually. If I go to the workflows tab and I go ahead and apply that client progress booking flow, as soon as this workflow kicks into gear, every single form, and in this case, it's going to be just that proposal, is going to be applied to the project immediately, right? Which gives you time to edit those forms if you want to make custom changes to them. Now, the cool thing is, right, I'm going to send this form a couple times in this flow, but if you do have a situation where you need to manually send that, right, you can go to the forms tab. Let's go ahead and refresh since it hasn't loaded in yet. As long as I'm sending the copy that the workflow applied, and as you can see here now, I didn't apply this proposal, the workflow did. As soon as I just refreshed the page, the workflow is responsible for sending this. If I send this and they complete it, that's the same copy that the workflow is currently watching. So that will work, but if you send a new copy or you add a new copy, sending it outside of the flow and it's not the one that the workflow applied, then your triggers will not function correctly. I know that's a little bit hard to maybe conceptualize, but just make sure that you're sending the copy of the form that the workflow is applying. So as soon as you apply your workflow, you can go to your forms tab to see all the forms that were in it. Make sure you're sending those ones if you're going to send them manually. Cool. I think I'm a little behind in chat. Let's take a couple more minutes here just to make sure we're not getting left behind. Carolyn, I'm not quite sure what you mean for the project date selection, a set selection. When you're setting a project date, that's only going to be on a form and it does not have anything to do with the scheduler. So we have project dates, which are these dates here in the top left corner underneath the project title. And then we have our appointment dates and times. Those are two entirely separate sets of dates and times, right? You might have one project dates and you could have an appointment date that would be entirely different. All right. Fiona, so clients do not see that there's an error on your workflow. They'll never know that that occurred. The best way to see that you had an error in your workflow is if you go to the projects page here, under the workflow kind of column here, you'll see active, right? So that means my workflow is currently running. There aren't any issues. If there are any workflow errors, this will be paused and you can easily see, okay, why is my workflow paused is what you might be thinking, right? Unless you have a pause workflow action and that's part of your flow, that's just something to keep an eye out for. If you see that orange or yellow paused badge right here under the workflow column, because it's going to automatically pause it. Otherwise, there isn't going to be a notification for that. With the one exception being if you have any email errors, right? Maybe your email account got disconnected and the workflow is trying to send an email. Dubsado will send you an email saying, hey, go ahead and reconnect your email if that was the case. Otherwise, for the other errors, you won't be receiving any kind of notification email. Devin, good question about invoices. So if you have a $0 invoice, you actually can't close those. The way Dubsado closes invoices is by applying an uncollectible balance against that invoice balance. And if there's a $0 invoice, there's no balance to apply that uncollectible balance against. So the only option at that point is to go ahead and delete those invoices. And you can do that either from the individual projects, or you can go to reporting and invoices to see all of your invoices there and delete them from there. All right. Just getting a little bit more caught up. Let's see. And again, I do apologize if I scrolled past a question. I didn't quite get to it. We got a good amount of content to cover as far as going over our triggers. I want to make sure I'm getting all the questions answered since I know there are a ton of questions about workflows. All right. Okay, Allison, good question. So as far as how to set a reminder for sending a contract or a reminder to sign the contract again, you could just use a send contract action again. You could also use a send email action too, because since there's only one contract, that contract link smart field will operate anywhere in the system. It's not specific just to that action. So there's a couple different ways to set up that reminder, but you wouldn't actually want to do send form since a contract is technically not a form. So make sure you're using either a send email with the contract link smart field in there, or you can just use a send contract action, right? Which is just going to automatically throw in that send contract smart field if you're just using the default email. The third way to do it, the last way to do it, is to set up a form reminder using expiration, right? So if I go over into my forms here real quick, I don't want to get too far off topic, but if I go to forms and let's take a look at this contract as an example. If I go to the form settings page and then I turn on the expiration date, if I say like relative, something like that, I could add a reminder here. These will go out automatically and it will have a link to your contract and they do not need to be a part of your workflow. So you could do that if you'd like to. Just keep in mind that setting an expiration date means if the client does not sign or complete your form by that date, it's going to then lock and they won't be able to complete it after the fact. Like let's say someone forgets about it, they come back, they still want to work with you. You'd have to manually unexpire that form for them to sign it or send them a new copy. All right. I'm going to jump back over into my slides. Looks like we got a couple more questions. We'll come back to that in just a minute here, okay? All right. So now we're on to our appointment triggers. So we've got three different options for our appointment triggers. And we have after an appointment is scheduled, which is going to be looking specifically at when that booking occurs, right? So not looking at the actual appointment date and time. It's looking at when that client or you on their behalf booked that appointment. Then we have before an appointment start time, which is looking at obviously the start time of that booked appointments. And we have after an appointment is ended, looking at when that appointment actually ends, right? So the idea here is that as long as that scheduler template is being sent by the workflow, then the workflow will know the date and time that the client picked for their appointment, right? So no matter how long or how short your appointments are, you could have a 15-minute discovery call or a 2-hour deep dive on something like we're doing kind of right now. The system will know the start time and the end time that the client picked. And then you can time different actions based off of that information in the workflow, but as long as you have sent that scheduler in the workflow. So, and a really common thing that I see, a really good counterexample to that is if you have a scheduler that's embedded on your website, for example, and a client books from that publicly available scheduler that's on your website, that scheduler is not being sent by a workflow. It's just existing outside of your flow. That means that you cannot then use the appointment-based triggers because the workflow doesn't know when that appointment date and time is, essentially. Additionally, these triggers are not meant to generate appointment reminders. The best way to do that is to go into your scheduler template and go to the advanced tab and then set up reminders there. You could technically do it in a workflow, but it's a little bit clunkier, and you're going to be able to use your appointment-based smart fields. So looking at like, hey, this is your appointment start time, end time. If you have conferencing, you can include video conferencing there too. And those smart fields do not function in the workflow, which is why we recommend doing it in the scheduler template instead. All right. Before we get to the deep dive, let's go ahead and look at my example for appointment reminders, or sorry, appointments triggers. Go back to workflows here. All right. Cool. All right. So like I said, we need to make sure that our scheduler is being sent by the workflow. So the first action that I have here is we're going to send that scheduler, the discovery call scheduler, right after the workflow begins. Then after an appointment is scheduled, right, I want to go ahead and change that project status. So a common thing we would see here is discovery call booked. See that status all the time in people's accounts. Then we're maybe send something like an intake form as soon as that appointment, or sorry, 1 day before that appointment starts. Maybe something like where you need to give your clients some time to fill out maybe a longer form, but you want to make sure they get it in their hands before you sit down to meet so you can use your time effectively. And then lastly, maybe you have a booking flow that starts after that appointment has ended. And that's just to kind of kick off the rest of your process. This is a really common way that I see folks doing these things, using all three of those different triggers. Let's see if we got any more questions. Jesse, unfortunately, I don't have any way to transfer these workflows to y'all's accounts. I would love to. That'd be awesome. But my best recommendation would be to go back through the recording and the slides, since there's both going to be accessible after the webinar, and you can always refer back to the way that they were all set up. The slides have screenshots of the way these workflows are set up. And as well as in this recording, then you'll be able to see if I click into the edit of any of these actions, you can see more specifically how it's been set up there too. But I do apologize. There's no way for me to give you the workflows, unfortunately. Okay. I'm sorry, Devin, if you've got 40 to 50 projects or invoices, the best way to do it if you have that many is definitely from the reporting invoices tab over here. Because at that point, then you can go through and just click the 3 dots and say delete. Or you can check the boxes here. Do like that. If you have more than one invoice, you got to delete at a time. All right. Ariana, which email were you referring to? I may have moved on since you asked your question. I apologize. So if you want to resend that question, I can get to it. Amber, I think what you're recommending, right, where you have, let's see, you're selecting the date for them. Okay. Yeah, so you definitely don't need to send a scheduler if you're just picking a project date. You could email back and forth if you want to manually set it for your client, because you don't want to give them the ability to kind of control your calendar. At that point, then as soon as you agree on a time, then you could set that project date yourself instead of letting the client fill it out on a form. And you could also do the same thing on a scheduler, right? You can book on behalf of the client using a scheduler without giving them access to it. I'm not going to go into that flow today because that would be a little bit of a longer conversation. But if you send me an email afterwards, I can walk you through how to do booking on behalf of the client using a scheduler template if that's what you're trying to do. I know you said you don't want to use a scheduler, but it sounds like that might be what you wanted to do if you are using a scheduler. Oh, Jilliana. Thank you, Jilliana. I didn't realize you're in here. Hi. All right. Troy, good question. So if you have a website embedded scheduler, there really isn't a workflow or a workaround rather for the appointment date and time and using that date and time in your workflow. The best thing you're going to be able to do is, let's say you have a publicly embedded scheduler in your website, and then you have like a lead capture form that's attached to it, right? It's going to start a project and start that workflow as soon as the client submits it. That workflow can then be done, after appointments, or sorry, after all previous actions completed, which is going to be essentially the same thing as after an appointment has been booked, but there's no way for it to actually see the date and time. The best you might be able to do would be adding a create to do that tells you, hey, go double check the date and time they picked. And you could then set the workflow in the project at that point, looking at those dates and times. Maybe even using fixed. That might be the one time I'd recommend using a fixed date and trigger, since you would just have a particular date and time. But currently, there's no way for it to actually see that date and time if it's not happening in a workflow. Josie, good question. So if you want someone to fill out a questionnaire before booking a date and time, then the only way to do that, since there's no way to invert the order of your scheduler, a form, and then maybe an invoice afterwards, right, for example, is just have them fill that form out by itself. And then after the fact, use a workflow to send that scheduler. It would be two different pieces or two different emails, or maybe a lead capture form on your website and then an email for the scheduler, but there's no way to invert that order as far as just the scheduler is concerned. So you would have to split it up like that. Danielle, yeah. So when you first start in your account, you will have just that sample workflow. I went ahead and built these extra workflows as examples in my account here. And you can build as many workflows in your account as you like, but using that sample workflow is a great place to jump off. And you can always refer back to these slides, like I was saying, to maybe build some workflows that are similar to these. Just keep in mind, right, there's almost an infinite number of combinations for workflows. So no one's going to have the exact same workflows. Totally don't feel like you have to build the exact same ones that I'm building here. All right. Oh, okay. Good question, Ariana. So for the contract reminder, let's take a look at it real quick. So if I go to, didn't mean to do that. We go to templates, and then I go to canned emails. I go to edit templates. It's going to be the form reminder. Where are we here? Contract completed, form reminder. So this one actually, I've brought this up before, since this was a tiny little bit of an error on our part. The contract, and for any form reminder in that case, it's going to use this form reminder, and it does use a form link, and I've tested this. It does work. So Ariana, that's a great question, because it's the one instance where this technically is incorrect. It should be using a contract link smart field, but don't worry. Specifically, only in this case, for a contract reminder using an expiration, this canned email will function. So you don't need to mess with the smart field, but if you want to change the wording, feel free. Just know that it's going to apply to any kind of form reminder, not just your contract. Really good question, though. All right, what else we got here? Rhonda, show us how to test a workflow and see what clients see. I never feel safe until I do that. I think later on in the process, I might have a good moment to actually show you what that looks like. So if you want to hang tight with me a little bit, I'll show you how to do that, okay? And Joni had exactly right. You can add yourself as a client and assign the workflow to yourself. And then when you're sending yourself that content, you can just open it in an incognito window or a different browser to kind of see from the client view. But it's the same kind of way you would test your forms out and everything too. Like I said, we might have a chance to do that later on. Sharika, yes, you can customize those emails after the workflow is started, so long as that action hasn't fired yet, right? So if you have actions later on that send forms or send emails, you can always click edit within a project and then customize that email at that point before it gets sent. If you have custom wording you want to use and that you need to toggle within the project essentially, but you will have time so long as the workflow isn't sending it straight away. Yeah, you got it, Troy. Okay, there we go. I finally cut up to the bottom here. Okay. For the appointment scheduler, I've included a canned email inside. How do I make sure it is sent when it's triggered in the workflow? Right now, I have a backup email into the workflow of the scheduler. Oh, I see. So, Aaron, if you're referring to the canned email that's in the actual template here, if I go to templates and scheduler, these emails are just the default ones, but whenever you're using send appointment scheduler in the workflow, you're going to be picking a different canned email. It'll have a very similar or the same email to start with, but whatever email you pick in your actual template setup, right? The actual action, if I go here, it's going to send that one. So if I say edits, right now this is the same email because I just didn't change the default. But if I picked maybe a different one, right? This will be the wrong smart field, but I can pick any email I want to. Whatever email I select here in this modal will be the one that does get sent. All right. And Elizabeth, just to follow up on that, currently Dubsado does not have SMS reminders, but it's something we are working on. And the scheduler is in beta since we are still just working on improvements. It has been in beta for a little bit, but the scheduler is going to be getting a pretty sizable overhaul, hopefully coming up pretty soon. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be fantastic. Thanks, Juliana. Okay, still got a decent ways to get through here, so hang tight, everybody. We're going to jump back over into our slides. All right, so now we are in our deep dive section. So like I mentioned, there's a couple things in our workflows that I think warrants a bit of a closer look since they're not obvious as to how to use them straight away. So for our deep dive, we're going to talk first about after form is not completed, right? So after form is not completed, I think is one of the most useful triggers because it really helps us to specifically send reminders for forms that haven't been completed. And on top of that, right? Let's say you have a bunch of these after form not completed reminders sent. If the client fills out that form at any point before other reminders have been sent, it won't send those because it knows that they've filled that form out. So if you're familiar with our invoice payment reminders, it works very similarly to those, right? Where if you have a reminder set up to go out for a payment, the client pays before that reminder gets sent. They don't need that reminder anymore because they already paid you, so it won't get sent. Same kind of idea here. If a client fills out a form and you have these reminders set up, they won't receive that reminder if they've already filled it out by the time that trigger comes to pass. So the important thing to talk about here is that this trigger is watching for the last time the form was sent, which isn't always the thing that you might be thinking of when you're trying to build out your process. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. So when you set up this trigger, you do need to make sure that you're selecting a form to watch. That's a common issue that I see folks just forgetting to grab a form to watch. And it's probably because when you're selecting after form is not completed, this form to watch option pops up and it won't be there unless you pick that option. So just keep an eye out for that when you're actually building your flow. Some options will give you additional settings that you'll need to fill out in order for it to actually save properly. All right. Then as I was mentioning before, if you're using this trigger and you're sending the exact same form again, the workflow is actually going to send the same exact copy. It's not going to make a duplicate, which makes it really easy to line things up in your workflow. Then if you have an expiration date set on your form and it's set to send that form, and it's set to send the form reminders outside the flow, the timer for this trigger will be reset, right? So those, how's the best way to say this? The form reminders, the ones we were just kind of discussing about, right? If the form that you've sent in your workflow has that expiration set up with reminders, it sending a reminder from the form expiration counts as a send, and it's going to start counting from that time it was sent to. So if you're going to be doing your form reminders in your workflow, I do recommend probably not doing both if you can help it, right? You might have an instance where you want to have an expiration date since you want to have a timeline for your client, but sending both form reminders from expiration date and reminders in the workflow can get a bit confusing. And then again, if you send a form outside the workflow, it will reset that timer for that trigger, right? It's just looking at the last time that that form copy was sent at all, anywhere. So since after form is not completed, watches the last time that a form was sent, using multiple actions to generate form reminders in your workflow can be a bit tricky, but we usually think about the first time a form was sent, right? If you're thinking, okay, I have this proposal that goes out and I want to send reminders a day after, a week after, and a month after, right? When you say a month after, you're talking about the first time you sent it, right? You're not talking about since it was last sent, but in Dubsado, it's counting from the last time it was sent. So you do have to do some quick math to figure out how to set that up correctly. So I've got a little pop quiz for y'all. So for each of the actions below, how many days have elapsed since the form was initially sent? So we've got send proposal if proposal is not completed in 1 day. Then we have send proposal if the form is not completed in 2 days. And then we have send proposal if that proposal is not completed in 4 days. If you have guesses as to what the right answer is, or if you know the answer, go ahead and throw it in the chat. Let's see if anybody gets it. I feel like I'm in Vegas. We got a bunch of sevens popping up. This is great. Good job, everybody. I know I worded the question as like a multi-part answer actually, because I was asking about each of these, but as far as that last action is concerned, it is 7. So the people who said 7 for that last one is correct. Here's the answer, right? So 1 day has elapsed since that first reminder is sent. That one's pretty straightforward, right? So we're going to send that form if that form is not completed in 1 day. Pretty cool. Then the next one, right, is looking at that last time that reminder was sent, right? So 2 days after the first one is sent is a total of 3 days. So we have 3 days that elapsed for that second reminder. Now we're at 3 days. And then if we're going to go 4 days after that, we're at a total of 7 days. So that's usually how I think about these when I'm setting up a workflow that's got multiple steps or multiple reminders. Just go one at a time. Go for the first day and say, okay, now we're 1 day plus 2 days is 3 days plus 4 is 7 days. Pretty cool. Yes, Patty, exactly correct. So Patty was asking if a client completes that form after the first reminder, the other 2 steps automatically get checked. They don't get checked so much as it's kind of hard. I didn't have a screenshot here to show you, but essentially these steps get grayed out and the workflow will skip over them. They essentially will remain in the workflow so you can see that they would have occurred, but they do not fire. The client will not receive those emails and it will just move on after that. Really good question though. Oh no, math class flashbacks. Yeah, hopefully that one wasn't too bad, but just something that's good to keep in mind because this is a really powerful tool in your workflow, but it can, especially if you're like, man, I need to have 5 reminders, it can get a little bit brain scrambly. So something good to go over. All right. Before we do after invoice installment paid, there's one other thing I wanted to show y'all about the form reminders. Let's jump over to Dubsado over here. Go to projects. Actually, before I do that, let's just go here in the workflow. So for my, let's see, after form not completed flow, so right now I have this exact example where I've got 1 days, 2 days, and 4 days. So let's say I wanted to do, in my head, I'm like, okay, I want to do 1 days, 2 days, 3 days, and 4 days. Let's go ahead and add another action. So all I'm doing here is I'm going to actually start at the top. So I got send form for the when setting. I'm going to go ahead and say after form is not completed. Now I have that form to watch. As I was mentioning, right, that option wasn't there before, and it popped up as soon as I clicked after form is not completed. Then I'm going to tell it to watch for that proposal. And then here below, I'm going to pick that proposal once again because I want to send the same exact form. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that guy. Now I'm going to go ahead and say apply. Well, before I did that, sorry. For my example here, I wanted to put 3 days so I can show you something interesting here. Okay, so in this scenario, let's say I wanted to do something like this. 1 day after, 2 days after that, 4 days after that, and then another 3 days after that. If you're really with Dubsado, what's the issue here? If anybody knows, it's okay if you don't. This one's max tier, I would say, difficulty because it's very confusing. I agree, Jesse. I apologize, but that's why we're here. We'll get it all sorted out for you guys. But essentially, before anybody tries to get after it too much, 3 days after is going to trigger as soon as 3 days occurs, and it's not going to trigger in this order. Essentially, we'd have 1 day after, 2 days after, then the 3 day after would trigger, and then the 4 day after would trigger. So we'd end up with, let's see, so we got 3 days, it'd be 6 days, and then we'd have 10 days. So even though you lined it up in this order, you're like, hey, I want the flow to work in this order. It's something to keep in mind is that these triggers don't care what order they're in. All they care about is looking at the number of days that have elapsed since that form was last sent. So even though I've listed it here, the 3 day action here is going to actually trigger before the 4 day action. Confusing for sure. I apologize. But I just wanted to show you an example of what I've seen because we actually get into a situation where once I get to 4 days, I can't do anything less than 4 days for the next reminder. Like let's say I wanted to have another one go out after 4 days. The next nearest one I could do would be something like this. I do see this sometimes. 4.1, right? Or 4.01 or however small you want to get that. But anything less than 4 days is going to fire before the 4 day action one. So if you want to do subsequent reminders, you're always getting bigger in numbers. Just something interesting to keep an eye out for. All right, let's come on back over here. Cool. Kimberly, is it better to set up a workflow for each phase of a workflow discovery call? That's a really good question, Kimberly. So that's one of those things that Dubsado has a ton of, which is it's entirely to your own taste. I know plenty of users who set up individual workflows for each phase because it's maybe sometimes easier to maybe edit those workflows and kind of see each phase discreetly, be able to be like, okay, this is that onboarding phase, this is my booking phase, and then kind of go from there. If you have it all in one workflow, then it might be harder to see visually when you're looking at the flow where that phase starts and stops. But that being said, it is totally fine to have one long workflow. I've set a lot of workflows up that are one long workflow, and I've set plenty of workflows up that are multiple phases, and you kind of have them daisy chained together. There's no wrong answer there. Whatever makes more sense to you is going to be great. Patty, good question, I think. So the first 3 steps, the first 3 steps aren't being sent at the same time in that scenario. They're just going to be going as what we talked about before, the 1 days, 2 days, and 4 days after. But 4.1 is then 4 days and a tenth of 24 hours later after that day, right? After that 7th day one. So doing that 0.1 is just the only way to make that last reminder get sent the 4th instead of the 3rd, essentially. Time of day, I mean. Yeah, at that point, then it would be hours, right? It would be that 0.1 would be hours. You may have to then do some extra math in your head to figure out what time of day it would get sent, if that's what you're asking. Okay, we're gonna jump back over here. How are we feeling, folks? I know we're pretty deep in here right now. If we have, how are we feeling? Hopefully everyone's feeling pretty good, getting a lot out of this. Hopefully, we're getting there. We have a couple more of these deep dives to go through, and then we'll be workflow masters. I promise you. Hopefully everyone's doing all right. So after invoice installment is paid, cool, Kimberly. Thank you. I appreciate that. You're perfect. Okay, cool. All right. So after invoice installment paid, this is really useful when you're trying to time an action to occur after a client has made their initial deposit or payment. But there's a few things that you should keep an eye out for. And so making sure to select an installment to watch is something that is first and foremost. Same kind of situation, right? We won't see this after invoice installment paid unless you have a payment plan in your workflow. And when you actually select this option, then this installment to watch will show up. Make sure you pick an installment or you will get an error. This cannot find payment schedule for scheduled payments and then a long string of letters and numbers. That error will occur in a couple different ways, and that's one of them. And then the second way it would show up is if you have a proposal that gets sent in your workflow. Since proposals can have a payment plan applied in their settings, you do not want to have overlapping payment plans, even if it's the same template. And so what I mean by that is if you have a workflow template that has a payment plan and you have a proposal that has a payment plan, those two payment plans sort of fight each other and they don't really cancel each other out, but the system gets confused as to which one to watch, even if it's sending the exact same payment plan, if that makes sense. So the key is if you want to use after invoice installment paid, we have to make sure that the workflow template is the one that's applying the payment plan and not our proposal. Let's see here. So before we get to this example, let's actually show you what that looks like over here. All right. So as you can see here in my template, I have a 50-50 payment plan. Now my proposal, right, is the first thing that I send. So the key here is I want to make sure that this proposal does not have a payment plan. So if you ever want to double check, since you can't see the proposal settings from here, you want to go back into your form templates. Cool. Then we're going to go ahead and say form settings, and we can see under payment plan, there is no payment plan here. That's the most important thing. If I had done something like this, and I put that payment plan in there, and I save that change, as soon as that workflow sends that proposal, you'll see that cannot find payment schedule error. Since there's two payment plans, does not matter if they're the same or different payment plans, the workflow does not know which one to watch. So the key here is to make sure that there is no payment plan in your proposal template. Go back to the workflow and kind of go through the rest of this. So the rest of this was just, I was just trying to show you an example of how this could be useful, right? So we're sending the proposal. We are sending a reminder. We've got some project statuses again, and then we're going to go ahead and activate the portal. Oh, hang on. Oh, sorry, it was change project status. There we go. So I only want to change this project status to deposit paid after they pay that installment. I don't want to move them into that status if they haven't paid yet, right? So I can kind of take my entire process and split it up into some pretty fine chunks. So I know at a glance, really specifically where everyone's at. That's a really common way to use this after installment paid, looking at maybe like a deposit. Cool. All right, so let's head back over here. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the create invoice option here because this isn't super common, but for the couple of folks out there that use the create invoice option and maybe don't use proposals, this is definitely something that you want to pay attention to. So hopefully this will be helpful for those folks. The key here is that there's not an automatic way to use after invoice installment paid in conjunction with that create invoice action. And that being said, there's a manual workaround where you can still kind of time other actions off of that create invoice payments on that, as long as you are making sure it's being toggled to the primary invoice. And so if you're not familiar with primary invoice, we'll actually look at it real quick together. Like I said, the key here is that you ensure that the invoice that's created by that create invoice action becomes the primary invoice. Now, if your project didn't have any invoices in it, that invoice should automatically get assigned to the primary status. But if you do have other invoices in that project, you will need to manually go to the invoice list, toggle which invoice is primary, And then you can go back into your workflow and edit which trigger you're using at that point. So let's go ahead and try and mock this up real quick because it is a little bit touchy, but like I said, for the couple of folks who aren't using proposals, this could be really good. All right, let's take a look. Oops. So I'll show you my little workflow here real quick for this. So in this create invoice workflow template, something important to point out too is that since I don't have a payment plan in my workflow, and that's important, right? I don't want to override the one that I'm sending in my actual create invoice, or just it'll actually open a new invoice itself to begin with. It'll get confusing. The key is just leave this blank if this is something you're trying to do. And then as you can see right here, this send email action, I want to send this email specifically when that payment is received. Not looking at just the whole invoice, I'm looking at an installment. However, if I click edit on this step, I don't see that option, right? This is something that you maybe didn't notice before, is that the after invoice installment paid option only shows if the workflow has a payment plan in its settings. So for now, I'm just gonna say after invoice paid in full, and then we'll actually go move over to the project real quick. So let's go back to our project. I'm gonna go ahead and archive this workflow that I had on here. All right, let's make sure there's no invoices in here. Actually, there is an invoice in here. Maybe it'd be helpful to leave it. So as you can see right now, if I click on invoice list, this is the only invoice in the project, and it's by default here, it's the primary. So I go back to the workflow. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply that workflow, which was create invoice, say apply. So we'll let that run for just a second here. So essentially the system is going to go ahead and create a new invoice, and it's not going to be the primary invoice. There's no way for it to automatically juggle which invoice is primary, but that's the piece that we're going to go ahead and do manually. As you can see in this flow, I actually created a to-do that's reminding me to go ahead and do that because I knew that I wanted to time this email after that particular installment was sent. So I can see here my reminder is telling me to make the new invoice the primary invoice within the invoice list. Then I can set the correct installment to the next action, which would be this action here. So I'm going to go to invoices. Then I'm going to click on invoice list. And now we have two invoices, right? So this is that new invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and say make primary. And now my create invoice is the primary invoice. I can head back to the workflow. And here I should be able to go ahead and say edit. We're going to say after invoice installment paid. And I can go ahead and pick my deposit installment. So once I set that up, now, right, I can sit back and relax and know that as soon as I've done that, now my workflow is back to being automated. There was just one wrinkle in there since I had to toggle that invoice and set that trigger manually in the flow within the project. Definitely kind of a niche use case there, but I thought it was pretty nifty when I saw that you could do that because I know some folks really just don't need to use proposals. They're just using that create invoice option. It's a little bit simpler for them. This could be a good thing to do. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and archive this guy. Let's jump back over into their slides. Cool. Am I at the bottom here? I am. Cool. All right. Okie dokie dokie. Let us do this. Cool. Okay, now we're on to appointment triggers. Now we had some questions about this earlier, but similar to some of the other triggers we've already discussed, you will need to select a scheduler / group to watch because you can do the same thing with scheduler groups when you're using any of the appointment-based triggers. So we're watching for something to be booked using one of those templates that was sent in the workflow. If you don't pick a scheduler or group to watch, it's going to result in a similar workflow error where it's going to say, I can't find the scheduler that you're talking about. So the key here is that unlike a send form action, that send appointment to scheduler action is going to send a brand new copy of that scheduler each time you send that appointment scheduler, even if you select that same template to send. And so that's actually going to cause a little bit of trouble when we're trying to remind clients to go ahead and book an appointment, since there is not an after appointment has not been scheduled trigger. So we do have a really good workaround for this, but it requires the use of the activate portal or using the client portal option. So let's actually walk through what that workaround would be. If instead of doing after appointment not scheduled, this is what we would recommend doing. So before we get to that, let's actually go ahead and jump over into Dubsado here. So I've got two different versions of this flow. The first one, I'm only sending one reminder. And then we have on that last side that I just toggled to, a way to send this with multiple reminders, which is pretty cool. So let's go through the first one real quick. Then we'll jump back over to the more complicated one. So in this workflow, I'm sending a discovery call right off the bat. Then I'm going to go ahead and make sure I activate that portal, since if I'm going to send the portal link to the clients, I want to make sure they can actually get into their portal. Then this email here, and this is the key, right? This is a send email action. And then I'm going to go ahead and include the client portal link smart field here instead of doing another send discovery call or another send appointment scheduler action. If I did 2 send appointment scheduler actions, when I go to set up which scheduler to watch, there would be 2 options there. And you might have seen that back over here, right? If I go back to this last slide, right here, you can see how there's 2 different discovery calls right there. It's because I've sent it twice. It's applied 2 copies there. So if I go back here, the client portal is our workaround because as long as you've applied that, oh, we got one hand raised, sorry. We're okay. Okay, sorry, let me jump back into this. So whenever you've sent any content to your clients and you've sent it via email, it's automatically going to show up in the client portal. So instead of sending a second copy of the same scheduler, we're directing them to their client portal because they can always find that scheduler template that you first sent them. That will allow us to then go ahead and trigger something after an appointment is ended, for example, because we know there's only one copy of that scheduler template and we're still able to watch just that one copy. The reminders sending them to their portal to find that same link instead of sending the appointment scheduler again, which will send them a different link to a different copy of that scheduler. Cool. Thank you, Juliana. All right. Now, the other iteration of this, like I was saying, is this is only with one reminder, but I can actually do as many reminders as I like if I want to then go ahead and pair this with a secondary workflow. So over here, let's take a look at this a little bit closer. Cool. All right. So we're going to take that same concept, right? We're going to go ahead and send that scheduler in the workflow. We're going to activate the portal. And then for our reminders, we're going to use send email instead of send appointment scheduler. That way we can go ahead and get them to their portal to look at that just one link that we've already sent them. Pardon me. For anything that you want to trigger after booking, you're going to need to use a start a workflow action. That way, when they actually book that appointment from that one schedule that you sent them, it can kick off another workflow that contains the rest of your actions, essentially. The key then is that we also have to add in a pause workflow action. And this is so that we can prevent other reminders from going out if they book after, say, the first one, right? The way that this flow is set up, we're going to look at it a little bit more closely in Dubsado, but we have one reminder set up to go out a day after. We've got another reminder set out to go 2 days after that. Another one to go out 3 days after that. But if they, let's say they book after receiving just the first reminder, if I don't have this pause workflow action, right, then it's going to keep sending these reminders and it's not going to actually kick off the rest of our flow. So let's go ahead and look at it in Dubsado again. All right, so this is that same workflow we were just looking at. So the idea here, like I was saying, is that we're going to basically tell this piece right here, the starter workflow, to watch for that discovery call to be booked. Then we're going to pick a workflow that has whatever actions we want to have happen after they book an appointment. The key here is that there's no way to actually look at the appointment start or end time because the scheduler sent in the first workflow, and then the second workflow with our subsequent actions won't know the date and time that they actually booked. This operates kind of similarly to having a publicly embedded scheduler and then a workflow that's kicking off after that. It is really good that you can start things after appointment scheduled, but after that, you will have to manually kind of time out if you're working with just their appointment start time or end time. But then after that, like I said, we're going to go ahead and make sure we pause that workflow after all previous actions completed because we want to make sure that we're not sending additional reminders. Cool. Let's see. Allison, really good question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a good way to do what you're mentioning. Allison was asking about only showing the client a final invoice instead of drafting invoices. Currently in Dubsado, if you open an invoice and give it any value, so a $0 invoice doesn't count for that, but if you have any value on an invoice, it will automatically show up in the client portal, whether you send it or not. So I don't think there's going to be a way for you to show only the final invoice. What you could do, Allison, is just restrict the client's portal access until you've actually mocked up the final invoice. Once your invoice is sort of set in stone and you're not going to make further changes to it, maybe at that point you could then send that client portal information to give them access since they won't be seeing an older iteration of that invoice. All right. Almost there, folks. We got a little bit more to go. Cool. All right. Hold actions until. This is a fun one. So hold actions until is a workflow action. I know we're talking about triggers today, but this one is sort of an action that's masquerading as a trigger, or vice versa. It's trigger masquerading as an action. And it's because it's predicated entirely on the trigger that it's paired with. And it doesn't actually do anything other than stop things. So it's sort of a filler slash placeholder. But the idea is that it's really only looking at those triggers that you're pairing with it. This action, hold actions until, is perfect for using multiple conditions that need to be met before your action runs. So a good example of that would be something like this, right? Where maybe I don't want to send this email here, send clients the portal welcoming onboarding, until after the contract has been signed and an invoice installment has been paid. I don't want to send that email if only one of those two things has occurred, right? I need both of those things to have occurred in order for this email to be sent. If that's the case, hold actions until is perfect for this. The caveat here is that hold actions until will only prevent actions from firing if they use after all previous actions complete. An action that uses a different trigger will still run according to its trigger. So that's a really common, I think, confusion slash mistake that I see when folks are trying to use hold actions until, is they're like, why did my other action fire? And it's because it was looking at anything else besides after all previous action. The hold actions is only affecting subsequent actions that use after all previous actions complete. All right. Sorry, voice is getting a little dry. All right. So we got a little pop quiz for you. In the example below, what trigger was set for the activate portal action? Typo there. What trigger was used to set this action in place here? So the idea is, okay, maybe I wanted to hold these actions until after contract signed, after invoice installment paid. And in your mind, you're thinking, I want to hold everything, right? I'm not going to send anything else in here. But then this activate portal action occurred, right? You're like, why did that trigger? This one's kind of hard, folks. So if you don't have any answers, that's totally okay. We'll actually look at it together. But I'll give it one more second to see if anybody's got any ideas. That's totally okay if you guys aren't feeling up to it, because this one's pretty tough. All right, so the activate portal action was set to after form is completed and was watching that supplemental intake form. So the idea is that if this activate portal action, we'll look at it and without it being checked here so you can see how it was set up. Previous actions, yeah, not quite. Okay, so the activate portal action was looking only at this form to be completed. And if it's only looking at that supplemental intake form to be completed, it's disregarding everything else that's happening before that. This activate portal action could have taken place earlier or later. It's only looking at that send form action and seeing if that questionnaire was completed. The hold actions will not affect that, whereas it did affect this email because it was set to after all previous action is complete. So let's actually go ahead and take a look there. Where are we? All right. So like I was saying, so this first action here is sending a questionnaire. Then we're sending a proposal. We're going to send our proposal reminder. We've got two different hold actions until, looking at two different conditions. Firstly, being the contract signed and then an invoice installment paid. Then we're going to send that email. And that's the email that I want to wait until both of those things occur. And then we have activate portal after all previous, or activate portal after supplemental intake form is completed. Right. So since I have it set up this way, it doesn't matter that this is right here in the flow, right? I could drag that around anywhere I like. It's always going to fire after this form has been completed, regardless of these hold actions until. Setting form. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I know that one was a tough example, but that's a really good thing to keep in mind. And I think those hold actions until using those is really effective, because that way you can tailor your experience specifically to how you want it to be for you, right? I've seen a lot of instances where folks are like, hey, my workflow is pretty good, but sometimes things trigger when I don't want them to. Look into using hold actions until, because you can get really specific when things get fired, when things actually fire and send, by using hold actions until and using them correctly and using those after all previous actions complete for the other actions there. All right, let's go ahead and finish up here, guys. Thanks for sticking with me. I know this has been a little bit longer of a webinar, but talking about workflows is always important. We're almost done. So now we got our extra credit here. And our extra credit topic for today is going to be update project workflows. This is a topic that I see a ton of questions about, and I see a lot of users chatting in. I get questions about this on screen share calls all the time. So I think it's something that's worth diving into a little bit. So when you're editing a workflow template, you'll then see that update project workflows button at the bottom of that workflow template. It can be a quick way to update all the copies of that workflow that have been applied to your project, but it's got some really specific key details to keep track of, some specific logic that you'll need to be aware of. So if you add a new step, that step will be added to every copy of that workflow that's already been applied to your project. Even if you add it at a later or an earlier point in the project or the workflow, and that project copy is already past that point, it's still going to appear. So let's say you add that step to the bottom, and then, or not to the bottom, to the middle of that workflow, and the workflow in the project has already elapsed and gone past that point. It's still going to get added back to the middle there, which can be a bit hairy depending on what your triggers are. So something to keep an eye out for. However, if a workflow on a project has all but step marked complete, right, the entire workflow is complete, and you go ahead and add a new step, it's going to get added to that project copy anyways, but the project copy is not going to perform that action, because when a workflow is completed, it's effectively paused. So if that's the case and you do still want that action that you added to your template and then therefore your project copies to run, you can go ahead and click Force Now to make that occur immediately. If you edit an existing step, those edits will only appear on the workflows that have yet to perform that step. So that means that if a workflow has completed that step already and you make edits to it in your template, then click Update Project Workflows, it's not going to be able to edit that step any longer because that step already occurred. There's no way for us to go back in time and edit the way that it was sent, unfortunately. Yeah, so, okay, cool. Just making sure everyone can hear me, good. All right. Last little bit here about update project workflows. So we should also note that update project workflows affects in-use workflows on projects differently depending on how they've been edited within specific projects. So here's some examples. If you delete a workflow step on a project's copy of a flow, but not from the master template, then you click update project workflows on your master template, it's going to re-add that step that you deleted in the project copy. And then it will run as normal or error based on its trigger parameters. But it's something to keep in mind if you're somebody that tends to customize your project workflows, because then clicking update project workflows effectively wipes out your custom edits to that workflow. So something to very much keep in mind. Then lastly, if we have your workflow template and it's set to apply a payment plan, and then you edit that payment plan within a project, and then edited the workflow steps triggers, and then clicked update project workflows. Now it's a couple different then and thens, but it's essentially going to update and reapply the original payment schedule. And if you have triggers like after invoice installment paid, it's going to affect that. So just be wary that if you're editing your workflow templates and you're editing your triggers in your project copies, as far as your payment schedule triggers, clicking update project workflows might not be the best idea. The key takeaway here is that every single workflow in a project is going to be at a different point in the workflow for the most part, right? And it's going to be very difficult to know exactly how update project workflows is going to affect all of those workflows that are currently in use. So just be careful and avoid using this button if you think that, hey, I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen. You can also then go ahead and click View Workflows here, because that's a really good way to see where every single project that has that workflow is at in the process. It could give you a bit better of an idea as to how clicking Update Project Workflows is going to affect all your projects. All right. And with that, give yourselves a gigantic pat on the back. I know this is a little bit longer of a webinar, like I said, but you guys just stuck it out with me, and you're well on your way to becoming a Dubsado workflow master. So thank you guys very, very much for being here and attending, interacting with me. I appreciate it. I'm going to jump over here into the Q&A and see if there are any questions that I did miss. Let's see here. Okay, let's take a look. Ariana, I feel like we talked about this a little bit. We talked about how if you wanted to do invoice reminders, to set those up in your payment plan templates, and then the contract reminders can be set up doing a number of different ways in the workflow, or even using that expiration setting on your contract. And then we have, how do you attach a copy of the client's signed contract with a welcome email triggered after they sign the contract / pay the deposit? So for that scenario, keep in mind too that as soon as the client signs their contract, the system will automatically send them a PDF with the PDF of their signed contract. So if you didn't know that, you might find that including the signed contracts in their welcome email a bit redundant, since they would have already received it. But if you did want to, all you would need to do is include a contract link smart field in that email, because that smart field will work in any context. When they click it, it's just going to take them straight back to the same link that they already signed. And at that point, you could then use triggers like we just talked about to make that email go out after they sign their contract and pay the deposit by using hold actions until, like we just talked about. All right. Any other questions here, guys, before we jump off? Thank you guys very much. I appreciate all the kind words there, and I hope you guys got a ton out of this. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if you guys have any further questions, I know Jelena was dropping it in chat there. You can go ahead and send us a chat to reach our customer care team. You can check out our YouTube channel for more in-depth educational videos. You can also jump on Facebook to chat with other Dubsado users about how they've set up their accounts. And with that, we just hope to see you in the next webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.